Hello everyone, and welcome to this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group, with Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, bringing you all the chatter that matters across the franchised and independent dealer sectors.
Hello and welcome to this Motor Trade Radio weekday special. We're delighted to welcome back to the podcast Derren Martin, Director of Valuations at CAP HPI, joining us for an update on how trade values have performed over the course of April. So welcome back to the show, Derren. How's your month been, and how are you getting used to all these bank holidays?
Thanks, Curtis. Well, looking forward to a few more bank holidays.
Yes,
as well.
they won't go away.
But they can cause a bit of a issue for the market, I guess. A bit of a change in dynamics. But yeah, it's been another interesting month for values, particularly for EVs again. But also, for petrol and diesel, there's been lots of things going on. So.
I mean, you talk about it there. So let's, before we get into some of these sort of nuances and what's been happening in the month, and we can't, I think, can you talk us through, you've closed the book on April now, although, it's really just live. It's that cut-off point within the live data. You want to talk us through that headline figure at 3 years 60 that finished on, I think it was 1% down, or equivalent to about £200 in monetary value?
Yeah, so we've 1% drop at 3 years 60, which is that benchmark point, which is around £200, and quite a lot of similar value moves. Similar percentage moves. 1.1% at 1 year, 10,000 miles. 1.1% at 6 months as well, and then another 1.1% at 5 years. And once you get to the sort of the older measurement, 10 year, at the 10-year point, the values have dropped by 1.9%. So slightly more at that older end. And there is a little bit of a theme there that more damaged cars, older cars that maybe need a little bit more work, they're not quite sought after at the moment. But the nice clean cars at younger ages are still doing well, but people aren't necessarily buying work. But yeah, that headline figure of 1% is where we've closed for monthly subscribers. That's the accumulation of what's happened in live during April. But as we always say, there's loads of differences within what's moved. That 1% is not what's happened to everything, obviously.
And I mean, you do highlight in the editorial around the seasonality of what to expect normally at this time of the year. Do you want to talk us through how this April into May movement compares to sort of this time of the year and previous performances?
Yeah, it's the second strongest we've had for the month of April. If you ignore things like, obviously the first COVID period, we didn't move values around this time because the market was pretty much shut. We've had 2018, which we dubbed the year of the used car because the market was so strong. I think there was a 0.8% movement down in April then. But so this 1% movement is the second strongest, apart from that 0.8. Generally, if you look back over the years, values move between 1.4, 1.6, 1.8% over the last few years. Since we introduced live in 2012, and even before that, there was always a downward movement in April, because you get the cars coming back from March new plate activity, and you tend to get Easter in April. Occasionally it's in March, but it's usually in April. That can tend to be a watershed in the market, really, for values. And values do tend to drop around that time. People going on holidays, people not looking at buying cars particularly. They've got other things going on, other leisure activities, so that can tend to be a little bit of a downturn. So for it to be a 1% movement down, particularly when what's been going on with EVs, and that's within the averages, then I would class this April as relatively strong.
And Derren, looking at vehicle sectors, which ones stood out in terms of rises and falls over the course of April?
So city cars have dropped by the most in percentage terms. They've dropped by 1.6% at the 3-year point, which is equivalent to about £150 drop. Those that sector though has been the strongest sector over the last 12 months. And if you look at values in April compared to previous April, on average they were 8.8% above where they were a year ago. So they simply couldn't keep going up. I think that's the thing really. You've got cars that have gone up in value. At some point that has to stop. We have to remember that deflation of values is normal in the car market, in the used car market. We've been starting to get used to values either being very, very stable or going up over the last few years, but in general values do drop, and that's kind of back to probably where we are at the moment. And other sectors that have dropped, so SUVs have dropped by 1.1%. Smaller SUVs have dropped by a higher percentage, 1.4%. And you've got some examples in there that it's not just EVs that are dropping. Dacia Duster diesels come down 6%. The Ford Puma has come down 3%. Vauxhall Crossland X has come down 3% as well for the petrol, 2% for the diesel. So drops there as well. Pretty much all the sectors have dropped, with the exception of convertibles and coupe cabriolets, which have been fairly stable. So it's generally been drops across the board, but nothing huge. So as I say, that 1.6% on city cars is the biggest drop.
And before we look at EVs in particular, any observations around fuel type in regards to petrol and diesel values?
Yeah, so petrol values have dropped by, I think it's 0.8 or 0.9%, something like that, and diesel very similar as well. They're both reacting very similarly to each other. So there's not masses to talk about in that sort of overall petrol diesel thing. There's not like a theme on diesels dropping or anything like that. And with the sort of clean air zones springing up, there's still demand for diesel and there's still demand for petrol. And really for those types of fuel types and the hybrids as well to a degree, there's plenty of demand out there. All the retailers that we've spoken to have had a good April. They've said it's felt more normal, felt more like a normal Easter period, but it's still been good for them. So yeah, in that, those petrol and diesel cars have continued to sell well. And as I said earlier, particularly if they're in good condition, mechanical or cosmetic, no engine management lights on, no sort of heavy damage. If they don't need to spend time in the workshops, then they've been in demand so that dealers can get them on the forecourts quickly, and consumers have been actively buying.
And obviously, turning to EVs, we can't have a conversation about the market without talking a bit more detail about electric vehicles. But the values are down, I think, for the 8th month now in a row. I think it started last October, if I'm correct, and this time down 4.7%, which I think you cite that's equivalent to just over £1,000 on average. But this isn't quite as severe as we've seen, have we? And I know your editorial goes into quite a bit of detail around some of the dynamics that's taking place there. Yeah,
so it's a drop of 4.7%. Previous months we've seen 6.6%, 5.5%, and 5.4%. We can't over-egg that. They are big movements. We don't normally see movements like that. An average drop in a month in more normal times would have been 1.5%, something like that. So obviously people don't buy or sell in percentage terms, but so that's equivalent to £1,050 this month. At the 1 year point has been a 3.8% drop, which is equivalent to £1,300. So over that 8-month period, there's been nearly a 35% drop in values. So over a third of the value of EVs on average been wiped out in that time. So it's been an incredible period for it, and it continues. Yes, it's stabilized slightly because it's not as bad as it has been each of the previous 3 months, but that's still a big drop, that 4.7%. But again, devil in the detail. There are cars that have been more stable this month, EVs that have been more stable, and there are others that have continued to drop by pretty chunky amounts, really. And some of those, I've got some examples of some of the largest drops, which the Vauxhall Vivaro Life, I know it's a fairly niche vehicle, but the range isn't huge on that vehicle. That's come down by 11.5% in the month, which is over £2,200 at 3 years old. You've got the Hyundai Kona, it's come down by over 10%. Hyundai Ioniq has come down by 9%. The Corsa Electric has come down by 9%. You can see from the ones I'm sort of talking about there, Mocha Electric, nearly 9%. They're kind of mainstream vehicles that are dropping in that area. And I think that there's a reason for that, that some of the ranges aren't great. And also with the drops that have happened for vehicles like more aspirational Model 3, I-Pace, they are now a lot closer in price to some of these mainstream vehicles, which means if you're a consumer, maybe you're going out and looking at a Nissan Leaf or something like that, and you realise that cars that there's Model 3s that are selling for early £20,000 now, for a little bit more on your monthly payment, you can afford something that's more aspirational, or you could afford a slightly older aspirational vehicle instead of a slightly younger, more mainstream vehicle.
And you do make a point in again in the editorial there that I think the sub £20,000 EV market has been hit by a 6.6% drop, and you can't, it may be alluded to in some of those examples there. What's really driven that lower end price market in terms of that ahead of the note that overall figure of 4.7?
Well, yeah, there's more of them around, so there's more volume in the market for those sort of more price rangey cars. The consumer isn't out there buying in huge numbers. They are wary about EVs. There's obviously, I think, lots of consumers now know about the drops that have happened. That has spooked people a little bit. Dealers aren't buying in bulk. The auctions are reporting varying amounts of various conversion rates, but lower than ICE across the board. So that price point of 15 to 20,000, that's where some of the ranges aren't quite so high. People buying EVs, maybe if you can afford it, you're buying at the higher end, because you can afford to. People looking at a 15 to 20,000 pound car, are they out looking for EVs? And as I say, the Model 3 and the I-Pace, cars like that are now closer in value because they've dropped by so much. They're closer in pound note terms to these more mainstream vehicles. So a walk up to a Tesla is quite an appealing thing for a consumer, and dealers are now back out there buying those sorts of cars because they see value in them. We've spoken to dealers that are buying I-Paces and are doing very well with them. We've spoken to dealers that are buying Teslas and are doing well with them as well. That's that sort of more aspirational end.
I mean, it's fascinating, sort of tracking that movement within the EVs. I just wonder if there were any standout models in terms of rises and falls in April across some of the ICE models.
Everything that's dropped in those big chunky amounts has been EV. So if you look at the sort of the top 15, 20 models, it's been EVs. Then for petrol and diesel, the drops haven't been anywhere near so severe. So there's nothing that I sort of could highlight as standing out as a big downward movement there. We have seen some cars rise in value. Convertibles have done quite well. I think that the biggest riser we saw this month was about a 4% increase, and that was the 2 Series convertible. The Toyota GT86 has increased as well, so it's sort of that more sporty vehicle that you can get to see at this time of year as we head into the summer. Convertible sports cars do quite well. So yeah, what else has gone up? Jaguar F-Type's gone up as well, 8 Series. So, but there's not that many cars that have increased in value this month. It's generally been stability, a small downward movement for petrol diesel cars, just a little bit of a realignment going on there, and then EVs that have there's some that have been more stable, as I say. Model 3 and I-Pace have dropped by 2 or 3%. Others, those examples I gave earlier, have been dropping by far more, and there's a realignment going on in EVs, and it's really difficult to sort of to predict what's going to happen there, because different models are falling at different pace. And previously we were sort of saying that EVs looked expensive versus petrol and diesel counterparts. It's not necessarily the case anymore. We're seeing the equivalent EV on, say, a Mocha or a Golf some way below the petrol equivalent, and still not selling in great numbers. So there's still some sort of inconsistencies in that area.
And I mean, there's a lot going on, and you cited where there's people going out buying EVs now, and I think Robin Luscombe, we're going to be talking about him this week, or gone to the press saying now's the time to be going buying EVs. But away from EVs a little bit, what's the dealers now telling you about stock levels and consumer demand now that we're into the second quarter of the year? New vehicle production is up globally. We've just this week they've talked about obviously UK production being up. What's the sort of sentiment out there with the dealer network at the minute?
I think they're all in a good place. I've not spoken to a single dealer that's been negative about April. As I say, Easter was a bit of a more normal period. It can be more challenging. Dropped away a little bit, but only in line with probably expectations. So I think that's okay. Stock level wise, I think that probably most would like more. There's still a shortage out there. There's still not as many vehicles as there were obviously pre-pandemic. There's been a fair bit of press about the registrations in March that they were up. But if you look at the first 3 months of the year, they were still some 30% down on the first 3 months of 2019. So there's still a shortage of new car, which obviously doesn't generate so many used cars. But then there are companies, Motability are now getting more cars in the new car market, so they're churning their cars. So there are vehicles appearing in the used car market, but possibly not enough for the dealers to satisfy all of that demand, really. So I would say it's a little bit of equilibrium at the moment, really, between the dealers that are sort of looking to actively buy and the vehicles that are actually out there for them to buy. And that's why it's a small movement down rather than a larger movement down, really, but just because there is sort of that equilibrium there. So it's it's really interesting to see these dynamics, and it'll be really interesting to see what May brings with sort of 3 bank holidays and a school holiday in there.
Well, speaking of which, Derren, because we always ask you what are your expectations for values over the coming weeks, and as you say, we are entering this new extended May bank holiday season. So, how do you think these next couple of weeks are going to pan out?
So from the dealers that we've spoken to, you've got some that are quite upbeat about the bank holiday, saying they'll bring consumers out, especially if the weather's not particularly brilliant. Then consumers will go out and look for cars, so it can be quite an active time. For others, a little bit of trepidation because it does mean people go on holiday and maybe they won't be out. So I think the jury's out, really. I'm not sure when we last had a month with 3 bank holidays in it like that. Certainly, sort of in the middle of the year. So I would be predicting May to see potentially similar to what we've seen in April. Small movements down again. As I say, you should expect that anyway. It would be strange for values to keep going up, but that obviously has happened over the last few years. So I think we'll be seeing small movements down for petrol and diesel cars, more of the same. EVs, I think there's still some movements to come on EVs. I think there will still be some drops in those models. Might not be quite as bad as we've seen already, but for some models it probably will be. And there's still got to be some realignment, some relativity, if you think about it that way, that people are looking at the price of similar cars and just, so where does the Leaf sit next to a Model 3? There's got to be a price gap. Where does the Corsa E sit within that as well, because of the range? So I still think there's some realignment to come and a little bit of volatility in the EV market. But consumers are buying them still. There's still interest in them. And as you mentioned, Robin Luscombe, I thought it was a good article. He's out there buying. Yes. He's out there buying cars. There's opportunities there for EVs.
Yeah, and you just mentioned there the point where that iPace and Tesla now moving, a £5,000 gap closer to a Nissan Leaf, because the Nissan Leafs have dropped by 8,000, the others have dropped by 13,000. So a lot of dynamics starting to play out there. But as always, it's always a lot of detail in this month's editorial. So anybody listening today, then we would urge you to head over to the CAP HPI website, which is cap-hpi.com, and on there you can go to the full editorial. A lot of detail, a lot of information there, particularly when you start to look at some of the model shifts on there. Or you can catch up with Derren on his LinkedIn feed there, and he'll I'm sure he's shared the editorial and happy to get into any other detail you want to talk about. But that is it from us for this week. And Curtis and I are back at the weekend with the Saturday headlines as always. And we just wish you a fantastic bank holiday, Derren. I'm sure you're eager to get a few days off and ready back at it again until the next bank holiday the week after. But thanks for joining and giving us an update as usual.
Pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group. Philip and Curtis will be back with the week's big motor retailing headlines on Saturday. Live, on demand, wherever you are, and on your podcast feed. In the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with Philip and Curtis, come on the show or send a press release, then email them at motortraderadio@yahoo.com. You can also join the Motor Trade Radio, LinkedIn and Facebook groups, or follow the podcast on Twitter. You've been listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast, bringing you all the chatter that matters.